Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for spending some time with us today. If you enjoy our conversation series, make sure you never miss an interview by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our work across the globe. Well, since the end of World War II, Holocaust movies have become an important genre and the de facto Holocaust education for so many. And yet, the most nuanced ones seem to have fallen through the cracks. In his new book, Holocaust Cinema Complete, a history and analysis of 400 films with a teaching guide, Rich Brownstein provides a comprehensive, well-researched look at the genre and how the Shoah has been portrayed in cinema. After a career in Hollywood, Rich has become a leading international expert on the history and use of Holocaust films. And since 2014, he has lectured for Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies in Jerusalem, specializing in the use of Holocaust film history and pedagogy. We're fortunate enough to have Rich here with us to go in depth on Holocaust Cinema Complete, and to talk about how Holocaust films can be an invaluable part of education and remembrance. Hi, Rich. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate your taking the time.
Thank you, Dan. It's wonderful to be with B'nai B'rith.
Well, for our audience, and this is the obligatory first question, but it's an important question. Tell us more about your background and how did you become interested in and then ultimately an expert and an authority on Holocaust cinema?
Well, I started being interested in the Holocaust when I was 12, when I saw Leon Uris's, the miniseries from Leon Uris's book, QB7. It was the first miniseries ever made about a Nazi doctor who was discovered, played by a young Anthony Hopkins. And then a few years later, when I was at the B'nai B'rith International programs in Starlight, Pennsylvania, they forced us to read after lunch. And I didn't really want to, but I decided to, and they had QB7 there. So I read the book. And so I started to learn a lot more about the Holocaust. And by the time I was in my early 20s in college, I was on the board of the Oregon Holocaust Center, and I was teaching Holocaust studies at a local religious school. And I just kept learning about the Holocaust. And then I moved to Hollywood after college and had a career there and just kept up on the genre. And I sold my company in 2003 and moved to Israel. And I had an opportunity to teach for the Young Judea year course program. And I volunteered to teach a class about Holocaust film for these gap year students. And so I watched every film I could and developed a curriculum and developed a methodology for analyzing these films. And a few years later, the people at Yad Vashem found out what I was doing, and they asked me if I would teach visiting educators who came from around the world the proper use of Holocaust films in the classroom and their history.
No, you mentioned when you were 12, you became interested in QB7, and we were chatting before we began the program. I was 10 years old when my parents took me to see The Diary of Anne Frank with Millie Perkins and Shelley Winters and Joseph Schildkraut. In those days, I know my parents were interested in seeing this not too long after the Holocaust, I would say 14 years after. I think the film came out in 1959. But there were so few films at that point that, at least in the public domain, what do you think happened between 1959 and as we moved into War and Remembrance? There was more coverage on television, perhaps a documentary or two. Why did we go from nearly nothing to what ultimately became, in your book, 400 or so films?
Until QB7, there were about 3 Holocaust films made a year internationally. Some of them were well known. Fred Zinnemann made one. Sidney Lumet made The Pawnbroker in '65. Kirk Douglas made a very good one called The Juggler about a Holocaust survivor. Orson Welles made one called The Stranger, where he was an ex-Nazi. This was right after the war. The Search was made right after the war, with Montgomery Clift, about a young boy who was a survivor. But once we started to get into the 1970s, after Cabaret, then television started to get involved, and then really the dam broke in 1978 with Holocaust miniseries, and Nielsen reported that 1 out of every 2 Americans saw that, and then 4 years later we had Sophie's Choice, which was a very big event, and then War and Remembrance in '89, and then Schindler's List in '93, and they just keep flowing to where now about 10 Holocaust films now are made a year. Today, most of the films, half the films that are made are remakes. But really, since 1945, there have been about 450 internationally by 45 countries, which doesn't seem like that many in retrospect. But the reason it seems like there are so many is because of the 77 American-produced Holocaust films, 21 have been nominated for at least 1 Oscar. So when 30% of the films keep showing up, you think they're a lot. And from 1960 until 2015, on average, every other year, a foreign language film that was Holocaust related was nominated. So it seems like there are a lot. There aren't quite as many as people think there are.
Well, you've written a comprehensive guide. How did you go about choosing the films to be in the book? Is it every one of them? Did you decide to leave some out? What was the thought process that went into compiling the list and the narrative work that you do on the films?
Well, no, nothing was left out. Some were excluded because I didn't think that they had enough content to be Holocaust films, like The Book Thief. But there's an appendix that lists the ones that I didn't feel made the cut. And there's an appendix that lists 450 films. So no, if it existed as a feature film or made for television, non-miniseries, then it's in the book listed. About 70 or 80 of them are unavailable, have never been seen probably outside of their premiere or a film festival. Some are from Eastern Europe that you can't find, that can't be found. But nothing was excluded. But I don't write about individually about every film. I write in my chapter 9. I write about the 52 that I highly recommend. So there are capsule reviews of the 52 most recommended films, but all are analyzed in terms in the statistics in the chapters that go through production.
What constitutes a Holocaust film? You mentioned The Stranger, for example, which I've seen several times, and the scenes in this movie, I think, take place in New England. I think it is, where this guy becomes a professor, and Orson Welles. So the venue is not necessarily in Europe itself. What do you need to, in the definition of a Holocaust film, to make it in the book?
That's a great question, Dan. I break it into four major categories. So if the protagonist was a Jew who suffered during the Holocaust, then it's a victim film. And The Pianist is an example of that. Life is Beautiful. There are many of them, over 100. If the protagonist was a Gentile who either helped or hurt the Jews during the Holocaust, then it's a Gentile film. 2/3 of those are righteous Gentile films, like Schindler's List or Irina Sendler, The Zookeeper's Wife, and a third of them are unrighteous Gentile films, like Conspiracy, which is about the Wannsee Conference. The third category is if it's about a victim of the Holocaust after the war, survivor, then it's a survivor film, like Harold and Maude or X-Men. And then the category that you're talking about with The Stranger, if it's about a Nazi who goes into hiding and then is found, usually killed or dies, then it's a perpetrator film. There is a fifth category, tangential or miscellaneous, which is for films that are clearly Holocaust films, but don't fit into those categories, like Sophie's Choice, where Sophie wasn't Jewish, so she couldn't have been a victim or a survivor, and she wasn't a perpetrator or a righteous Gentile. But it's a Holocaust film, or Inglourious Bastards, or Cabaret, which documented pre-war Germany. That's how I got up to 450. And many of the films have flashbacks. They don't all, but if they fit into those categories, then they're in the book.
Well, I'm interested also in what was going on behind the Iron Curtain. What was going on in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, until between 1945 and the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, 1989. What kinds of films? This was the scene of the crimes. These were the scenes of the crimes in all of these countries. How many films were being made in those days, in that period, about the Holocaust? Because oftentimes in the communist system, Jews were lumped together with as victims of fascism, rather than being portrayed as the principal victims of Hitler. So were there films being made in those countries in those days?
There were, and there were many of them. And you're right. The narrative, the communist narrative, was that they were all victims of fascism. But these films don't go there. There are films that do, but none. The ones listed in my book, several dozen, including the Soviet Union, several from East Germany, and many from Czechoslovakia. They are about Jewish suffering. There were many films that were filmed at Auschwitz, some right after the war, about Jewish suffering, that were directed by survivors and cast. Survivors were cast. So yes, they were brave. Some were not able to be released. There are records of the Soviets actually washing some films right off the stock to erase them. But The Shop on Main Street is a great one, and there are many that came out that were very good and much less exploitative than many of the films that we're familiar with today.
Let's talk about what you describe as the finest Holocaust film ever made, The Gray Zone, written and directed by Tim Blake Nelson, who actually wrote a foreword for your book. What is the movie about, and why do you think that The Gray Zone is the greatest in this genre?
The Gray Zone is a 2001 film that debuted the weekend of 9/11. And that's why nobody saw it. It stars Harvey Keitel and David Arquette and Steve Buscemi and Mira Sorvino and many others. And it's about the revolt at Birkenau at Auschwitz, where a group of the Sonderkommando, the people who were responsible for manning the crematorium, everything from leading the prisoners into the dressing rooms to getting them into the gas chambers and then cleaning them out and harvesting them and burning them. It's about a group of Sonderkommando, a true story, who revolted and destroyed 2 of the 4 crematorium toward the end of the war. And they were never rebuilt. So it starts with a great story that needs to be told. And then Tim Blake Nelson learned the lessons of all of the other failures and successes of Holocaust filmmaking. He didn't, for example, bathe the film in violins and in music. He relied on the sound of the camp, the churning of the death machine. He didn't have people speak with indistinct, non-recognizable accents. That the Jews spoke as the American actors spoke, and the Germans and Ukrainians spoke with accents. So that the dialogue wasn't encumbered like when you see David Schwimmer's accent in Uprising or Liam Neeson in Schindler's List, where you're saying, what is that accent? So if you're an American, particularly, it seems more natural. And the dialogue is like David Mamet, as if David Mamet had written it, where it's on many levels. But the real key to the success of it, beyond the editing and cinematography and the story, is that it shows these people as people. And we're so accustomed in Holocaust films to want survivors and victims to be heroes and to be flawless, and that doesn't comport. Nobody is flawless, and nobody is necessarily a hero. Especially in the gray zone, they do heroic things, but they're not heroes, and it's a distinction that really mattered in this filmmaking. You see people toiling. You can imagine that you had to feed a gas chamber several times a day, the toll that it would take on an individual. And he gets it. He gets the beats down that make us think these people are in excruciating pain. And that's why it is a great film. Well,
you've said it's the greatest film. What is your favorite film? Because greatest and favorite, are they the same, or do you have a favorite film?
It's hard to watch The Gray Zone. I watch it so much academically that it stands alone. Sean Penn was in a great survivor film called This Must Be the Place. I love that film. Very few people saw it. It's with Frances McDormand. She's in it too. And Harry Dean Stanton, I think, was one of his last films. Harold and Maude is one of the greatest Holocaust films. I can see that often. Conspiracy, about the Wannsee Conference with Kenneth Branagh and Stanley Tucci and Colin Firth, is a great watch. The Birch Tree Meadow is a wonderful film about a woman, a survivor, who late in her life goes back to Krakow and to Birkenau and deals with her ghosts. The Fateless is a great film. The Counterfeiters is a great film. They're not like they're my children, but I think that many of them are just breathtakingly wonderful.
Go ahead.
No, go, please.
You talk about the Wannsee Conference and its 80th anniversary. The Wannsee Conference this year Um, I'd like to talk, we'll talk in a minute about these films as educational tools. But since we're breaking it down and we're talking about a list of the films that you like and you feel are the greatest, arguably the most famous and celebrated Holocaust film, Schindler's List, you said that it might have been better. Tell us about your take on the film.
All right. Well, I'm going to mention one other film that I really like, called Made in Israel, which was made in Israel by Ari Folman. And it's a delightful film that contemplates a time, as they say at the beginning, so far in the future that Israel has a peace treaty with Syria. And as part of the peace treaty, the last Nazi is turned over to Israel on the Golan Heights in the middle of winter. And the question is he going to make it to Jerusalem for trial, or are the Israelis just going to, rogue Israelis going to kill him along the way? It's a fabulous movie. As far as Schindler's List is concerned, I have the greatest respect for Steven Spielberg and what he tried to do. But in the end, it is the story of a Nazi who saved Jews from Germans. And that's not the story of the Holocaust. It's, as Stanley Kubrick said when he was talking about Schindler's List, the Holocaust is about 6 million people being killed, not about several hundred being saved. And it was 1,100. But Kubrick's point, which was the same as Claude Lanzmann's, is it turns the Holocaust on its ear. It's inside out. That aside, putting that aside, because there are many films, there are many righteous Gentile films about people who saved more Jews than Schindler did, including Wallenberg, who was killed for it, and de Souza, and many. But he took a Nazi. He found the most reprehensible person he could, who then redeemed himself. And only Spielberg could do that. Aside from that, one of the ways with which we judge any art is with the economy that it tells its story. And here, Steven Spielberg took an hour-and-a-half story and turned it into a 3.25-hour film to get it off his chest, to get everything done. And in our parlance, he schlepped it out unreasonably. I also have great problems with the Jewish representation, and I think they were cutouts. I'm particularly troubled by the ending of it, where he breaks the fourth wall, takes people to the gravesite of Oskar Schindler in Jerusalem, and he implies through that the state of Israel exists because of the Holocaust, which is not the Jewish narrative. And he further complicates it by playing a song from the 1967 war, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, over that, as if there's some correlation between the reunification of Jerusalem and the Holocaust. And when the Israeli version was made, that is the Israeli print, that music wasn't used. Eli, Eli was used. But the final problem that I have with Schindler's List is the shower scene, the shower fake-out scene in Auschwitz, where he takes people who are fresh off of a train, and one person may be whispered to that they're going to their death. And then he puts them in a room that's sealed like a gas chamber, and he makes the audience and the people inside believe that they're going to be gassed. And he schleps that out too for 70 seconds. And everybody seems to know by the end of that is all the people, the thousands, the 2,000 people in that shower seem to believe they're going to be gassed too. And there's no reason for them to believe that, because they're not in a gas chamber and they wouldn't have known. It was one of the most heavily guarded secrets that the Germans had, these disoriented people. But so somehow magically one person's whispered to and everybody knows it, like it's some sort of a Wes Craven film. And he just does it for shock value, like throwing Indiana Jones into a snake pit. It wasn't what the shower rooms looked like, and it misrepresents the idea. It implants an idea that the Jews just walked to their death.
Well, let's use Schindler's List as a kind of a kickoff point for the discussion about the educative value of films and of these films. And you've talked about QB7 again. To go back, I've talked about The Diary of Anne Frank. So in every generation, there has been a film or films that have reopened the discussion, that have introduced to non-Jewish audiences and to Jewish audiences the subject of the Holocaust writ large. And I think, we're partially of, we kind of, you and I perhaps transform a couple of generations. But for many, Schindler's List was the next in that line, which, aside from the points that you've raised about accuracy and other points in film, began again a discussion about Holocaust remembrance and education. So can it be that films serve a purpose beyond complete accuracy if they're able to trigger conversations, discussions, and the like about the Holocaust? What do you think?
Well, I need to differentiate between a couple of things. The cultural impact of Holocaust miniseries and Schindler's List exceeds that of anything that was ever done in all of Holocaust education. Their impact was incalculable. They put the Holocaust on the map for the general public. But that's not an endorsement of it. That's just a cultural fact. And it doesn't, just because something is widely seen doesn't mean that it's educationally worthwhile. Today, 10 years ago, the equivalent big film, which I do recommend, is Inglourious Bastards. The most recent film that people use, that they talk about, is Jojo Rabbit, which I don't endorse. It's not about accuracy. Steven Spielberg was very accurate with many of the parts of his film. What he was inaccurate in it doesn't. It's not the only reason I dislike the film. But all narrative film is fictional. Even if it's a true story, it's fictionalized. You're not seeing what happened. You're seeing an actor portray something in the words of the writer, as directed by a director and edited and shot. Whether it's Lincoln or anything else, you're seeing a historical reenactment, and nothing is exact. So that's not the issue here. The issue is, if you're watching a farce like Inglourious Bastards, or Tarantino's most recent film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, you're a fool if you believe what happened in it. Even if Inglourious Bastards was based on the Ritchie boys, who there was a sliver of truth about that. None of them went in and killed people like this, but there was a sliver of truth. And in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, if you walk out and think Sharon Tate lived after the Manson massacres, then that's on you. But there are great farces, and there are very good victim films that aren't necessarily based precisely on what happened. I will say, however, that the most famous Holocaust fiction film ever made was Life is Beautiful in 1997, which won a bucket full of Academy Awards and is the third highest grossing foreign film in American history. And it was a fantasy about Auschwitz, which you look back on it today, and it's laughable, not because of what you're watching, but because you can't believe that anybody would have made this. And since 1997, only one other major feature film has been fictionalized, completely fictionalized at a death camp, and that was The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which was equally horrendous. So it's not a function of whether it's historically accurate. It's a function of the story that they're trying to tell in it. Can you flop around with your kid in Auschwitz? No. Can a kid be hanging out between barbed wire with the commandant's son? No. So those just go so far beyond what's reasonable that there's no reason to take them seriously. Jojo Rabbit has other problems, but it was a farce. So my problems with that were that they just tried too hard to make it funny.
I just want to ask you about where these films are headed today. You know, what's being made today, and the reason I'm asking is the further we move away from 1945, and now with the number of survivors passing away, just the numbers just accelerating. We saw last year thousands passed away. Do you think we're looking now at Holocaust films whose message is more toward the universal side rather than telling the story? And I feel sometimes that this is happening, that the uniqueness of the Holocaust and what the Jewish people endured and were victims of perhaps might be slipping away a little bit from us. In place of that is kind of a universal message. What do you think?
Well, as I said, half the new films are remakes, but there are still good films coming out, like 1945, which is a great film about two Jews who are returning just after the war to their hometown in Hungary, or like Phoenix, which was a remake of Out of the Ashes about a survivor. There are great films that still come out, and it's not going to be a function. What is made is not going to be a function of what we need for our memory. Unfortunately, it's going to be a function of what sells. So there have been efforts recently to make streaming Holocaust content. Ava's story was an Instagram Holocaust affair that was preposterous. That a girl would be Ava Heyman, a real woman, that you take her diary, a real girl, and have her posting on Instagram during the Holocaust. And the Anne Frank house made one that was similarly weird about Anne Frank being a video blogger during the Holocaust, which makes no sense. And Ari Folman, who made the great Made in Israel, made a horrendous animated film about Anne Frank, about her diary. So good films can be made, bad films can be made. They're going to keep making them, and just like any other genre, most will fail and some will succeed. And thank God we have the testimonies of survivors so that we can find out what really happened, and we can rely on those for fact, and we can rely on Holocaust films to reinforce some lessons, but as a form of entertainment and as a form for us to feel closer to what happened, so that we don't forget. But I think that film production is in its own world, and it's independent of the fate of survivors.
Picking up again on education, you're a leading lecturer at Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies. And I know that educators come from all over the world to Jerusalem, to Yad Vashem, to learn, to study, to research. What have you found are the films that are the most effective in teaching about the Holocaust?
I think that well, it depends on the lesson that you're trying to teach. So no film is going to teach you about the Holocaust. If you want to learn about the French Roundup, then the RAF. If you want to learn about what the Italians did, then the Finzi Contini. If you want to know about life just after liberation, then the Truce. If you want to learn about Auschwitz, then the Gray Zone or Son of Saul. If I were to say one, and if you want to learn about Holocaust theology, God on Trial is a fabulous film. But I would say if you're going to pin me down to one film that I would suggest that supplement a Holocaust lesson, it would be Conspiracy, about the Wannsee Conference. Of course, depending on the students' ages and how they're prepared for it. But assuming that they're studying the Wannsee Conference, this shows how antiseptic the Germans were in explaining to the leadership of the German industry, German judiciary, the political arms, that the final solution was happening and that they were going to participate in it or they were going to be killed. So it's great filmmaking. It's a great lesson. And Kenneth Branagh and Stanley Tucci are spectacular in it. And they've become friends because they made that film.
What do you hope readers will take away from your book? It's going to be a go-to reference, I'm sure, for educators, for researchers. What would you like people to take away? Now, other than it's a compendium, but it's much more than that.
The only thing that I believe in education that matters is that there is no such thing as dogma, and that you approach every critical choice, whether it's about what to educate or with what you will educate, devoid of the baggage that we all have when we're judging things. So it's about what I hope that people take from my book overall is the importance of critical analysis, that we all need to be thinking about what we're seeing. And because of that, there are no sacred cows in my book. I take on Elie Wiesel, who fought against Holocaust films. In 1978, when Holocaust miniseries was made, he wrote a very long op-ed in the New York Times, and he did it again in 1989 when War and Remembrance came out, and he attacked films like Sophie's Choice, and he believed that these representations shouldn't be made, and late in his life he recanted, and he said that he was wrong, and that he was taught to love films, Holocaust films, but that he didn't know what he was talking about. But the point of the story, and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which he was the chairman of, was a direct result of the Holocaust miniseries that he railed against. And so my point is that we have to be willing to look at things with clear eyes. What matters and what doesn't. What is the truth and what isn't. If a film is bad, if it didn't uh, make money, or if it did make money, it's a bad film. And if it's a great film and nobody saw it, it's still a great film. And if you believe that teaching children using film is an important thing to do, then this is a guide to do it. So that's what I hope to convey.
Well, this would be a good point to mention your website, which is holocaustfilms.com. And now that the book is out, Holocaust Cinema Complete, what is your next project?
Well, I'm really trying to get out and speak about it. I'm grateful for B'nai B'rith for doing this, but this is what I'm doing. I'm trying to spread the word about Holocaust films, and especially with everything that's happening now with Maus and Whoopi Goldberg and Holocaust education. I think it's an important lesson, and I would be very happy to hear from your viewers at holocaustfilms.com if they have comments, or if they have opportunities for me to come and speak to their organization, or somehow be involved in what they're doing. I'm very happy to spread the word that way.
Well, I think really that with the increasing number of survivors passing away, without those, we've talked about the testimonies, without those firsthand testimonies of how and what they went through as victims, as that we move on to future generations. The importance of film, the importance of documentaries about the Holocaust, of course, loom increasingly more important. So the book is certainly a welcome contribution.
I would like to say, and I've never said this in any interview that I've done, that B'nai B'rith has been in my life since before I was born. And I have to tell you that nothing was more important in my formative years than B'nai B'rith. And my father was the international president of AZA, and my brother was the international president of AZA, and my sister was the international president of BBG, and I was just the district secretary. But my time in BBYO and later in the B'nai B'rith entertainment industry unit in Los Angeles was really, really key for me in my development. And I'm forever grateful for everything that B'nai B'rith has done for me and my family.
Well, it means a great deal to have you say that. And we're certainly proud of the pedigree that B'nai B'rith pedigree that you've just recounted. And again, thank you for that. The book is Holocaust Cinema Complete, a history and analysis of 400 films with a teaching guide by Rich Brownstein, and is available wherever you purchase books. Rich, thank you so much for joining us. You've created an invaluable resource for Holocaust education and remembrance. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, thanks again to Rich Brownstein for speaking with us about his new book, Holocaust Cinema Complete, a history and analysis of 400 films with a teaching guide. And of course, thank you for tuning in. Well, if you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you catch all of our programs by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter and Instagram. And be sure to visit our website, bnaib'rith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, Rich Brownstein and B'nai B'rith, I'm Dan Mariaschin. See you again soon.